All right. Welcome everyone to our final EDI speaker series with Dr. Nicole Kaniki. My name is Krista Craven. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Equity and Inclusion Learning Specialist in the Department of Equity and Inclusive Communities. I want to start by acknowledging the importance of the lands that we each call home, and in particular, the land in which many of us who are connected to Carleton University and who are living and working, and the land in which Carleton is located, is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. As we start our session today, I invite each of us to reflect on what it means to operate within a colonial institution on unceded Indigenous land, and how that shapes our engagement with the work we do in terms of both content and practice, particularly when it comes to the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. The Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series is an initiative of the Department of Equity and Inclusive Communities here at Carleton, and it's funded by the Canada Research Chair's EDI stipend. The speaker series has taken place throughout 2023, with 4 speakers in total coming to Carleton to speak to members of our community virtually to discuss issues of equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and anti-oppression in the context of higher education. So today we're delighted to have Dr. Nicole Kaniki here for our 4th and final session in the speaker series to discuss EDI demographic data, how it can or should be collected and analyzed, and what can be done with this information to support EDI at the institution more broadly. So please feel free to submit questions for Dr. Kaniki at any time during the talk, and we'll use these to guide the Q&A session with Dr. Kaniki after her talk concludes, recognizing that we might not be able to get to every question that is submitted to us. Also, all questions that are submitted through the Q&A function will only be visible to the session moderators, and you can choose to submit your question anonymously, so should you want to do so. So thank you so much, everyone, again. And I'll now pass it over to Eunice Oladejo, who is the EDI Speaker Series Coordinator, who will introduce Dr. Kaniki.
Thank you, Krista. Hello, everyone. My name is Eunice Oladejo, and I am our Speaker Series Coordinator for the Department of Equity and Inclusive Communities. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicole Kaniki today, who will be providing our talk. Dr. Nicole Kaniki is the director of Sonomi Solutions, an equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, consulting company based in London, Ontario, where she supports institutions and organizations in the development and implementation of EDI strategies. Dr. Kaniki has held several EDI leadership roles in post-secondary education in Canada, including as the director of EDI in Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto, where in her role, she examined, advocated, and advanced EDI in all aspects of U of T research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She is also the former special advisor on anti-racism to the president at Western University, where she supported the establishment of the inaugural office of the Associate Vice President EDI and contributed to the implementation of significant EDI considerations for the institutional strategic plan. She holds an MSc in kinesiology, a PhD in health and rehabilitation sciences with an emphasis in measurement and methods, and an MA in women's studies and feminist research. Dr. Kaniki has a passion for social justice and uses an anti-racism and decolonization framework in her EDI work. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kaniki as she begins her talk.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, Eunice. And thank you to Carleton for having me here today and to discuss such an important topic, one that I think is very, very relevant right now as academic institutions in Canada are trying to kind of figure out how do we implement equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's been a lot of commitments, a lot of reports done and committees that have been created over the past few years, especially over the pandemic and, with the racial reckoning and discovery of unmarked graves and sort of that realization that we need to put these things into action. And so, having these kinds of discussion where we can talk about it and have an opportunity to try to move things forward through action is so important and so crucial to the work as well. So I really thank you for allowing me the opportunity to have this discussion with you today. So I'm going to go right ahead and share my screen now and get started. So a little bit of background to myself too, and you'll hear me talk a lot about, again, where I come from, what has kind of brought me here today. You heard a little bit about my bio. I have quite a mixed bag of experience and education that has led me to doing this work as I do it today. My initial work and a lot of my academic and research actually has more so been in sports medicine, which is actually the field that I kind of come out of. But in my later years and more recent years, I really just started taking an interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion. Then that's when I went back to school again and did my MA in women's studies and feminist research. And that one really allowed me to have a anti-racism, anti-oppression, but also an advocacy and equity lens on the work that I'd already been doing, the way that I was already looking at the world. It just kind of gave me another new approach to see things and to see how systems and structures are built, how they're made, what upholds them. And really, because this is the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion, is to dismantle those things in academic institutions that are keeping some people out of those institutions and excluding them, and also treating them inequitably. So as we get started, I would like to invite you, and I have my chat open here as well, so I should have access to be able to see your responses. But before we get started, I'd like to invite you actually to write into the chat what if you, and I know we have a lot of students here today too, probably that are in and with us today as well. But if you can tell us what you were doing in 1983, or a moment that you remember from 1983. Again, some of you would be like, I wasn't born, I wasn't even a thought. But some of you might have been around in 1983. If you can just put into the chat just a thought about what you remember from 1983. And I think we have the chat enabled, so you should be able to see that. Just let me know if we don't. Oh, I see some folks responding in the Q&A. I'm not sure if the chat is actually enabled. Checking in. Oh, okay, there we go. I see it coming in now. Perfect. Perfect. I see someone not born yet. Some people are toddler. Oh, someone was in primary school in 1983. Elementary school, graduated from high school that year in the US. Someone was being born and then not born yet. Someone was in grade 6 in Michigan and was 12 years old. VP of a small drug company in the US, so already well established in 1983. Good stuff. Thank you for sharing. I'm just thinking back to me for 1983. So a little bit of my background. I'm originally from Cape Town, South Africa, so born and raised. And 1983, I was a 3-year-old toddler, but living in apartheid South Africa. If you know much about South Africa, we have quite a troubled past as well, very recent troubled past. And so for me, 1983 still earmarks a time in my life where I was living in legal segregation. Stuff. Okay, so now if you want to write for me, 1996. So maybe some of you were born now that were not born in 1983 yet, but 1996. Can you tell me 1996? What were you doing in 1996? Or is there something you can remember about 1996? At university, I see some folks at university by this time, finishing up high school in Alberta, in the UK, gap year. Yeah, from South Africa too, we do gap years in 1996 in university. Almost done with university, a couple. I remember email was pretty new for me at that point. Yeah, 1996. Yeah, I was 10 on a farm in Southern Alberta, living in DC. Good stuff, 1996. Yeah, 1996, for me, I was a 16-year-old teenager. Also, at that time, apartheid just ended. We started integrations a little bit more in South Africa. And yeah, I was at an integrated school. I think I'd been there now by this time for about 2 years for the first time. So teenager in grade 10, still not born yet. We have a couple who are still not born yet, 1996. Okay, let's bring up 2005. Where were you in 2005? Can you place yourself in 2005? Anyone maybe not born yet still, or finish up undergrad. I see some folks finishing up undergrad. So 2005. Yep. Starting a bachelor's again. This time I was 5 years old in Nigeria, working in Ottawa, just graduated from Carleton, just finished undergrad, grade 1, and your dog was your best friend. Awesome. Good stuff. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that with me, everyone. And one of the reasons why I like doing this timeline here specifically, again, too, even for me, 2005, I'm just thinking about that. I was actually in the US. I was graduating from undergrad at that time too, but it puts it into context for you where you were at, sort of what was happening in the world for you and in your environment. Because simultaneously, a lot of Canadians don't know that 1983 was when the last Black segregated school closed in Nova Scotia. During the pandemic, many of us learned for the first time, many of us for the first time too, that 1996 was when the last residential school closed in Canada. And then in 2005 was when the AODA Act was established. So this was really the first time we had sort of formal policies and processes in many organizations and institutions that ensured accommodation and accessibility for individuals with disabilities. Also, 2005 was when same-sex marriage was legalized in Canada. When you think about that, again, very, very recent, especially for us as a country that kind of prides ourselves in being very progressive. Same-sex marriage was only legalized in 2005 in Canada. So when you place yourself into where you were at in these dates as well, it makes you realize how recent so much of this history actually is, and how when these laws ended, when the last Black segregated school closed, or the last residential school closed, or when the AOD Act was established or same-sex marriage was legalized, those ways of thinking, those ideologies that upheld these institutions did not just disappear. If you know the movies Men in Black, if you're familiar with the concept of them, I always think about this because they have this thing in the series of Men in Black called a neuralizer. So the idea behind Men in Black is that they're these individuals who live on the fringes of society. Aliens exist. Aliens come down to Earth all the time. They create havoc on Earth. And then they disturb sort of and disrupt society. And then the Men in Black come in, they clean up, they get rid of the aliens, and then they call all the human beings together and they say, everybody look at the neuralizer, and then it flashes and everybody forgets everything that they had just seen. And so the idea behind the neuralizer is that we don't know that aliens exist because our brains get cleaned every time aliens come and we see them, and then we don't remember them. We didn't have a neuralizer when the last Black segregated school closed. We didn't have a neuralizer when same-sex marriage was legalized. We didn't have a neuralizer after the last residential school closed. And so understanding that our society still very much operates with the memory, but also those very ideologies that existed as part of those institutions. And so this is the reality, right? We are all products of our environment. The individual ideologies we carry into our educational spaces, our places of work, and the culture we build there is significantly influenced by the way in which we are raised, the people we surround ourselves with, and the social systems and structures that we are exposed to. Our ways of knowing and understanding the world is then also influenced by these nurtured influences, which follows that the way in which we relate to the people in our academic environments and our lived spaces, they're also affected by these. The social systems and structures of our Canadian context and most of the world have been shaped by decades of social development steeped in social hierarchies. Now, some of these are expressed here in this diagram, which shows an inside circle of characteristics that are seen to be more favorable or desired than those on the outside. Now, in society, we treat each other and relate to each other, whether consciously or unconsciously, on how we fit into the inside or the outside of this circle. The more you are on the inside, research has shown, the more likely you are to be treated well, get a job, be paid more, be mentored, receive professional development opportunities, be promoted, and so on. The characteristics and identities of the inside circle have also been deemed more desirable on hierarchies of intelligence and work ethic. Now, this is because of colonial foundations of knowledge development, research, and pursuit of truth and human understanding that was steeped in historical social inequities that created things like racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, and other oppressive ideologies. In our Canadian society and our academic environments, our institutions are no different in that they exist within the fabric of these environments as well. Now, privilege is what an individual holds when they're a member of some of the characteristics of the inside circle, and different degrees of power afforded them when they're able to access opportunities in these spaces because of that privilege. It is not the possession of that power and privilege that is a bad thing. We all carry some privilege. The mere fact that I am sitting and speaking to you right now, on this platform means that I hold a certain status of privilege and power, right? So holding privilege and power is not a bad thing, but it is the way in which that power is used over others that makes it harmful. This is very foundational to much of what I'm about to discuss with you. And I'd like you to keep this diagram, especially in mind, as we work through the rest of this presentation. I really like this quote from San Leon Chavez that really emphasizes the importance of our identities, who we are, and how we see the world based on our identities, our lived experiences, and what we've been exposed to, and the limitations too that those hold, right? Identity manifests in the way that we lead, supervise, make decisions, persuade, form relationships, and negotiate the myriad of responsibilities faced each day. As individual leaders, we practice within norms, assumptions, values, beliefs, and behaviors, and behaviors originated in our multiple identities. Who we are matters, and it matters to how we do the work, how we approach the work on a daily basis, and how we relate to everyone else in our environment as well. Now, understanding the impacts of EDI specifically, I mean, this is not just in research, and research is a lot of the title that I usually do, but understanding that the impacts of EDI in everything we do has its origins in history. And that history has impacted our current society. And in our current society, oftentimes they manifest through the biases that we see in our processes and our procedures, and the way that those policies are oftentimes implemented. And it leads to inequity, it leads to exclusion, and it leads to a lack of diversity. And it also impacts our lens that we approach this work and approach everything we do on a daily basis in the world. Assumptions is the mother of all failures. And unfortunately, this is exactly what kind of oftentimes causes a lot of the problems, is that we bring with us assumptions about who people are, their identities, their lived experiences. And a lot of these assumptions are oftentimes based in things like stereotypes and expectations, which are widely held but fixed and oversimplified beliefs or ideas about a group of people with shared characteristics. And those individuals are oftentimes held to those stereotypes and expectations, and limitations are put on them about what they're able to do, what they're capable of doing in society on a day-to-day basis. Also, confirmation bias, which is a mental shortcut engaged by the brain that makes one actively seek information, interpretation, and memory to only observe and absorb that which affirms established beliefs while missing data that contradicts established beliefs, is also a really strong bias that, again, leads to a lot of inequity and exclusion oftentimes. We believe something about certain individuals and we do not want to stray about it. We only look for information that confirms that belief or that bias that we hold about a certain individual or about certain situations as well. And now confirmation bias, again, too, when you're thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion data, is one of those things that strongly impacts how this data can be used in either a positive or a negative way. Now, we self-reinforce our beliefs through confirmation bias. We focus on results that support our worldview. So we believe something to be true, and we're only looking for information to kind of support that worldview, right? When you think about demographic data, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into that now in the next few minutes, but when you think about demographic data and you think about underrepresented groups, which is what we're talking about here today, in looking at it from the perspective of underrepresented groups, you know, again, my PhD was in measurement and methods. I'm huge into statistics and research design. In my work, we're all about statistically significant differences, right? Whatever is the loudest voices, that's what we pay attention to. If the majority of people say that this drug works, that's when it goes to market, right? And from a research perspective, oftentimes when the majority of people say a place is, you know, equitable and inclusive, we only believe them, right? We've only kind of considered their considerations of this. And so again, too, even the mere statistically significant difference is so rooted in this majority rules, type colonial concept that we hold, right? And so to take that from an EDI perspective, EDI asks us to flip that on its head and say, okay, what does the least of these say? You know, what do the least of the folks in this population actually say? Does it work or does it not work for them? Is it harmful for them or not? And then we ignore results that challenge our worldview, right? So again, if we already believe something to be true, we're going to ignore any results to the contrary. Again, it's only a few people saying that they don't have a sense of belonging at the organization. So what do we care? 80% of people say that this is a place where they feel they belong. But we neglect to look at it and say, okay, from those 80%, what is their identity? And those 20% that are saying that they don't have a sense of belonging at the organization, what is their identity? And then we design questions that are motivated by our bias as well. Oftentimes, we either formulate a question to get the answer we want, or we don't ask the question at all. Because if you don't have an answer, you don't have to address something, right? And I feel like in Canada as well, in the Canadian setting, that's what we've been doing for so many years. In the US, they've been collecting demographic data on people for decades now. I heard someone made the comment in a meeting once, as an American, they get asked their race when they buy a cup of coffee, right? Just because it's such a common thing to do. Demographic data documents are included in every process. Whereas in Canada, we don't ask that. Not even in our healthcare system have we consistently been asking these questions that are also so crucial to understanding health issues, especially for underrepresented or marginalized groups. We don't ask these questions about their identity, because if we don't ask it, we won't have the information. Again, if we don't have the information, we don't need to act, right? And so this is the power of data, the power of information. It can lead to action. And then we forget that data can only speak for the sampled as well, right? And when you think about the distrust that exists of institutions and organizations from underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, equity denied groups, you can understand as well why they oftentimes are not responsive in these surveys. And then we overlook boundary conditions, right? So these are things that are where it's specific to context. It's specific to a certain population or a certain location as well. And we want to kind of generalize information without realizing that that data or that information is only purely contextual as well. Now, again, I would be remiss if I didn't include just some definition of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how I approach it and the framework that I use in order to do this work and strategize in it. Specifically today, I'm going to emphasize that the rest of the discussion will be based on this aspect, diversity, so the D of EDI. But in defining equity, when I strategize or do the work of equity, I'm looking at and assessing for fairness, right? And I am evaluating power and privilege. I'm looking at a system or a structure and I'm asking who has power and privilege and who does not? And what are the challenges and barriers to those who do not? And how do we mitigate for those? What biases or exclusionary practices are causing some individuals to be less empowered than others within a system or within a structure? Diversity specifically is sort of the headcount, right? It tells us who is there, who is not there. And so this is what we're actually going to be looking at for the rest of the session today as well. And then inclusion. Inclusion is a measure of the sense of belonging, right? So it's about who is participating in the environment and who is not, who has a full sense of being valued for who they are and authentically being able to be themselves in that environment as well. So just gonna move this a little bit here. There we go. So specifically, when you think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, there's a few approaches you can take to it. These are just a few of sort of what we call the gold standards of EDI, of initiatives and sort of implementation strategies that you may have heard of or seen. Policies, we look at policies and how those are developed for EDI. Obviously, you're here today, so you've seen training sessions, talks and keynotes as well, and volunteerism. So committees, you might have seen committees, but then another strategy that we use in EDI is also surveys. One of the things that is true though, too, is that surveys can take up many forms. Surveys, specifically thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion surveys or EDI surveys, can take up two forms. They can be either demographic surveys, like I said, which is the one we're going to be talking about today, or they could be climate or environmental surveys. So you've probably seen or heard a lot of these very recently, as well as a lot of institutions are collecting information on that to be able to gather for strategic purposes. Specific to demographic surveys, these are largely quantitative. They usually provide benchmark or allow for evolving data sets. They can be called either a survey or census. We've heard them called sort of different things before: EDI survey, demographic survey, or a census or a demographic census. So they kind of go by a couple of those names. They can be anonymous, or they may not be anonymous either. So institutionally, a lot of institutions are also collecting this information. So I remember a few years ago when we started this work, when sort of EDI requirements were coming down to institutions, and we were sort of looking at what is EDI practices. What we didn't realize is that a lot of us didn't realize, at least I wasn't aware of it either, was that human resources had been collecting demographic information for many, many years already. And this information actually already existed in our systems. They were used in labor reporting for labor requirements, and so on. And they were actually on our system. And so when they're on your system, so usually when you become a staff member at the institution, you go through your HR forms that you complete. And one of them is actually completing that demographic data. That demographic data lays on the server, on your profile, and you can go, oftentimes you can go in there and you can change it if you want to. And so that a lot of that information has existed. Historically, a lot of institutions have only collected gender, some race, indigenous status, disability status as well, but very, very limited as well. But it has been collected. And so with demographic data, you can collect it in an anonymous form where you just have the form and you have, you just kind of send out the form and people just complete it. Or you can do it on systems like that, where you can actually still make a connection between an individual's name and say their gender, for example, because it lies on a system that holds all of that information together. And then it allows for comparative data as well, right? So you can go year to year to year. You can kind of measure and see as well, what the representation is of the population of your organization or institution. Now, climate surveys or environmental surveys, often includes a demographic survey question set. So they will often include things like identity, like race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. But they are largely qualitative, right? And they ask for lived experience of individuals and, sort of expanded questions on people's experiences at the organization. They can provide a starting point for EDI monitoring and evaluation, and they're really great to use for strategy or for strategic development of, say, an EDI action plan. I work with a lot of clients as well where I do these for them, and then we can actually develop like sometimes a 3 to 5 year EDI strategic plan as well for them from the information we collect in this way. Now, specifically to demographics. This is sort of, like I said, what is going to be most of our discussion for the rest of the session as well. And I just want to emphasize as well, please feel free to include your questions as we go through the Q&A. I might sort of be talking about something that you have a question of specifically, and just so that you don't forget, I want to invite you to just put it into the Q&A as well. And when I stop at the end of the session too, we'll be able to answer it. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into demographics and demographic information. So the purpose of a demographic survey is really oftentimes for many different reasons. There's many reasons why an institution or organization will choose to collect this information. So it could be for compliance. So like I talked about previously, labor requirements, they maybe need to report that federally for labor purposes. They might just want to know who is part of the organization, but who is not part of the organization. And demographic representation will tell you a lot about that. It might be for reporting purposes. So, every institution organization has annual reporting or, quarterly reporting or so, and they might be able to use that demographic information in those annual or quarterly reporting documents as well. Also, you can use demographic surveys to develop EDI strategies. So what you can do as well with that information, even though it only gives you representation of individuals that are at the organization or at the institution, but you can also see where your needs are. And if you disaggregate it, say by, students versus faculty versus staff and, per unit, you can see the representation across the institution in many different ways so that you can actually say, in this faculty, we really are underrepresented, women are really strongly underrepresented, or in this faculty, racialized individuals or visible minorities are highly underrepresented over here. And we really need to kind of think about it and consider how this is impacting, say, that faculty or that department as well, just for representation. And then too, oftentimes when you pair this information with qualitative data, it really gives you rich information about people's experiences that are related also to their identities. Like I said, our identities matter, right? And so if we know that certain individuals with certain identities have a very particular lived experience in your organization or institutional culture, then we can maybe mitigate for that or strategize better for that. And again, it just gives you a better understanding of the population as well. And to, this is just to sort of emphasize here when a couple of questions you need to ask yourself before you take on this exercise of collecting demographic data. I want to emphasize too, so I do this work a lot in research environments, but I know that a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is also very applicable for, human resources departments, and human resources work more generally. So just kind of, I encourage you as well to kind of think about it from those different perspectives, depending on where you're at and where you're going to be using demographic data as well. But a couple of questions to ask yourself before you start is, what change are you, so where you equals your group, your team, or your organization that is collecting this data, trying to create? One of the things that is really so true is that, especially for individuals who have been historically marginalized, who are from underrepresented groups, to share such information with you is very, it can be traumatizing and can be re-traumatizing from negative experiences that they may have had sharing their identities, or they may just be in a situation where they are, feeling oppressed and marginalized, or they're experiencing oppression and marginalization where they are at. And so sharing this information with you, their demographic information, they're trusting you to do something with it. So before you start collecting this information, you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do with this information that these individuals are sharing with you? What change are you going to be trying to create as part of this exercise of collecting this information? Make sure that collecting this kind of information, collecting EDI data generally, is not just an extractive exercise, but that you're also contributing back to those communities. And then two, being realistic about what your spheres of influence and control are. So understanding that if you are in a human resource, environment and you're collecting this information, understand what you can use the data for, what your spheres of influence using the data may be, and what it may not be, right? This is the other thing too, we're very careful with, is not putting, making promises or putting high expectations of what this information will be able to do. We know that this data is powerful, but even powerful data in the hands of people who disregard it can be very minimizing as well. So understanding what you can actually do, what you're capable of doing, what's under your control when you are collecting this data is going to be important. And then what would success look like to you? What is the end goal here, right? And then what is your honest capacity as well? Understanding that when you develop strategies like this and collecting demographic data as well, you have to understand what your strategy is. And this kind of goes into the next part that I'm going to talk about now, is about governance. You have to understand who is collecting the data, who is keeping the data, where it's going to lie, and so forth. There's so many privacy and confidentiality considerations you need to make when collecting demographic data. And so you need to be really, really clear about this. So for governance, when you're thinking about governance, who collects the data? So is it the institution? So internally, which part or which department of the institution? Who holds that data, right? Where does it lie? What server? Is it a server in Canada? Is it a server in the US? Is it a server in Scandinavia? Servers lie different places too. And then who responds to the data? Who is responsible for that? Is it your equity office? Is it HR? Is there an equity office in HR that will respond to data when, you see underrepresentation in your data set? And then too, with the collection, I talk about internal, external. So are you collecting it internally or are you collecting it externally? There's a number of organizations as well that do support data collection like this, demographic data collection, for organizations and institutions as well. Coming to privacy and confidentiality. Again, important to this work is who will have access to this data, how will the data be used, how will the data be anonymized and stored, because that's also an important aspect. Because you can collect the data, like I said, on your human resources, platforms that are, perfectly private, confidential, and safe. But when you say you extract the data that you just need, so you separate it from the identifiable information, where will it be stored? How are you going to anonymize that data? And who will hold that data as well? And then there's different options here, right? So your ombudsperson as well. An external contractor, as I mentioned, there's a lot of companies and organizations that are collecting this information too, or is it going to be with your EDI office? And importantly here, does your community trust whoever it is that is going to be holding this information? Because you need to communicate this very clearly to them, who will be in charge of this information, who will hold this information, in order to garner their trust as well to even complete this information for you. And maybe this is something I should have emphasized a little bit earlier, but what is on a demographic survey? The types of questions, and I did a little mini study with some students a couple of years ago where we contacted a number of academic institutions and we actually just collected their demographic surveys that they have for their staff and faculty. At the time, a lot of the institutions didn't have any for their students. I think one or two was starting to do one for students as well. But we just wanted to know what that form looks like, how they ask the question, what questions they include and so on. And it was very interesting to see, across Canada, how different those questions are asked as well, and the types of information that's included on a demographic survey, and sometimes also ones that are not included. But these are some of the types of areas that people oftentimes collect information on. Things like age, gender, sex, race, ethnicity and cultural background, immigration status, indigeneity, sexual orientation, country of birth, disability status, language, residence or postal code can as well, when they're looking to identify socioeconomic status, religion, and then caregiver status as well. So caregiver status is whether you have small children or whether you are caring for an elderly parent as well. This is kind of some of the information that is oftentimes collected in a demographic survey that can be very helpful to an institution and can actually inform a lot of their practices as well. And especially when you're doing what we call an intersectional analysis, I'll emphasize that a little bit later too. It can be very helpful to understand potentially what people's experiences may be, but what also their needs may be and where the gaps may lie in your services and supports that you need at the institution as well. Now, I'm going to talk about just a few areas that I want to emphasize here when collecting demographic data. Unfortunately, the length of time that we have here today doesn't allow me to expand too much into all of these areas. And so I'm just going to cover about 3 of them that I feel we really need to sort of demystify, but also better define what these terms are. I find that a lot of people get them mixed up. And so especially on demographic surveys too, they ask for one over the other when they, mean the other that they wanted to actually be collecting. One of these is gender versus sex. Now, gender specifically are the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse individuals. So this is all about our gender expression and our identity, right? It doesn't have anything to do with our biologics, which is our sex. Sex specifically is our biological attributes of humans and animals, including our physical features, chromosomes, gene expression, hormones, and anatomy. Those are 2 very different things. I've seen both of these on demographic surveys. And I've also seen the question for, please sort of choose your gender. And the only options are female, male, right? Which is incorrect because that is asking for sex. Gender would be woman, man, trans, non-binary, queer, and so two-spirit, and so forth, right? That is gender. Sex specifically speaks to male, female, intersex, right? And so people get this confused oftentimes a lot on demographic surveys. Also, sometimes they ask these questions inappropriately. You have to ask yourself, what information do I really want to know? Do I want to know the social aspects of an individual's identity? That would then be gender, right? How they move in the world, their experiences as the world kind of treats them according to their gender identity and their gender expression. Or are you maybe requiring sex specifically because it's for a specific reason that you're going to be collecting for, hormones or, certain things like that. Oftentimes sex is more so used, I think, on the scientific side. So for, scientific research or clinical research or so forth, where you're working with human beings where things like chromosomes and physical features and gene expressions actually impact whatever it is your question is about the data. And so when we're thinking about demographic surveys, sex should not be on those anymore. Like I said, unless they're for purposes of collecting them for clinical data. If you have not been on this website, the genderbread.org, it's a really great website with really great resources that explains the differences between things like gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, being romantically attracted to, being sexually attracted to as well, which are all very different aspects of who we are. And multiple combinations of these on different spectrums as well make up who we are. We are not binary individuals. We are not just feminine or masculine. Oftentimes we are on a spectrum between those two. Some have tendencies toward femininity, some have tendencies toward masculinity. But we as individual, as people, we are very much on spectrums on all of these. Even things like biological sex, even that we're on a spectrum. Not every female has the exact same amount of estrogen that their bodies produce, or the same amount of testosterone that their bodies produce, right? Or so, right? And so even biological sex is not a perfect absolute female, absolute male. We're all sort of on these spectrums of how we present even biologically as well. One last thing I just want to emphasize on that is that identity is not the same thing as expression. So your gender identity is not necessarily how you choose to express your gender as well. And again, too, as I've emphasized, neither of these are the same as sex. And gender does not necessarily equal your sexual orientation either. Now, when we're thinking about race, this is again, too, another complicated one that, I think it gets made complicated because of a lack of understanding that race is a social construct, not a biological construct of human beings. And one way that I usually emphasize this is that, so Seonjun Kim, Dr. Flenter, Dr. Watson, and Dr. Kim were the 3 scientists who developed the human genome. And, it was a big sort of discovery, big development. And Dr. Kim, who is of East Asian descent, wanted to compare his genomic makeup with his colleagues who were, as you can see, from European descent. So Fenter and Watson. He wanted to compare and just see if he could see something genetically different between himself and them, and genetically similar between the two of them, being both of European descent. What he found was that he is more similar to each of them individually than they even are to each other genetically. Again, proving that race is only skin deep, and race is a social construct. When you look at these individuals here, Lupita Nyong'o is Kenyan. She's African born, African descent. She is Black. Barack Obama, whose mother is white and dad also Kenyan, is mixed race. He could go either 50-50. So he could, on a demographic form, he could pick I'm white, or he could pick I'm Black, or he could pick I'm mixed race. And so the response you're going to get from him, or an individual who identifies like him, or with the background that he has, you're never sure of how they're going to choose to identify, because the way that we navigate our world is how we choose to identify even our race, right? And he could go either way, 50-50, if he chose to. But he's been, he's grown up, and he comes from a society where even just a little bit of Black in you makes you Black. And so he's identified and navigated the world as Black. I don't think he will necessarily choose white on a demographic form, because society where he has grown up and his lived experiences have dictated to him that he is Black. And so he will choose, he will check the Black, the box for Black, being Black, or African-American, as they would in the US, right? On the bottom, you have Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal, the two pictures you see there are actually the exact same person. Rachel Dolezal was an individual who was born white, blonde hair, blue eyes, but felt that she was Black. So she has, for much of her life, been identifying as Black. As you can see, she curls her hair, she tans her skin, and she, it was discovered a few years ago, she had moved her way back, sort of up into the NAACP leadership, so senior Black leadership in the US. And then it was discovered that she's actually white. And so you'll still see some interviews from her saying that she identifies as Black. And so, when you're thinking about it and you're collecting this demographic data, you have to ask yourself and understand too the limitations of that demographic information that you are collecting, that individuals don't necessarily, the way they respond in demographic surveys are not very predictable. They're not highly predictable, right? And so how are you going to use this information, knowing and understanding the validity of that data, how it was collected, and how people choose, especially when it comes to things like race and gender, how they choose to identify is such a personal question to them, and highly contextual to the individual as well. Now, I'm just going to touch on here a little bit as well, because, disability status has also been one of those that is not very well, I think, collected. Even the way that the questions have oftentimes been posed in many of the surveys that I've seen too, tend to be very insensitive. I was just reading one very recently where the question, the only way that the question was asked was, do you have any physical limitations to doing the job? This was in a job application, and that was how they were trying to identify disability status. And so, as you can see from that, really what that has brought, the way that that question was formulated is that, having a disability is merely a medical, a medical part of who you are, right? It disregards the fact that disability is inherent to the person themselves as well. And so this is where we've now more recently introduced the social model of disability. And so when asking the questions on these demographic surveys, we really need to ask ourselves, what are we asking when we're asking folks to identify as having a disability or not having a disability? And also, what are we going to do with that information? Because accessibility and accommodations goes so far beyond just, putting up a ramp. It's it's about how an individual actually navigates that space in so many different ways in creating an inclusive and accessible environment generally, rather than just we're going to put up a ramp. So thinking about that, about how you're going to ask that question, also what you're going to do with that information is going to be important. Just a little bit about the differences between the medical versus the social models, which I think is important to emphasize here as well, is that the medical model was developed by non-disabled individuals. The core tenet of it is that disability is a medical problem in need of rehabilitation, a cure, charity, and or welfare, and that the responsibility for change is placed on the individual with the disability to participate in the world. So the person must get better. The social model and the approach that we are taking, and especially when you're thinking about from an academic environment institution as well, really should be the one of the social model. I understand that and again, too, like I said, my background is in sports medicine. I'm in the medical field. And so, disability status is one that we use in the field as well, a lot through a medical model lens, but we're really being forced to add to this, the medical plus social model in sort of the medical fields as well. But I think what we're talking about as well, and especially when we're talking about recruitment, hiring practices more generally, and at the institution too, we need to really make sure that we're using the social model of disability. And this one was specifically developed by and with persons with disabilities. The core tenet being that society, not disability, is what disadvantages persons with disabilities. And the responsibility for change is then placed on society. So it's on us to create those environments and those ways of thinking that challenge ableism specifically. And so when you're thinking about that, I know I've kind of introduced a lot of information here about different types of identities as well to think about when you're developing your demographic surveys. But you really need to think about how you're going to respond to those, how the individual who is completing the form is going to respond as well, which is also why there's just so many things that you got to think about what that form is actually going to look like. So when you're thinking about it, the order of appearance is very important as well, right? So normally demographic questionnaires come out oftentimes at the end of a survey. So if you have a lot of other questions you're asking as well, it usually comes out at the end of the survey as well. And, if you're going through a human resources process as well, and someone's maybe applying for a job and you're including a demographic survey with the job application, you want to think about where you're putting that demographic survey or how you're asking them to respond to that demographic survey as well. Understanding that there's a lot of best practices to draw from. Make sure that you are implementing some best practices. Again, I've shared a couple here with you now. Also, allow opportunities for empty boxes for people to just be able to respond another identity not listed here, and allow an open box for them to respond to as well. Qualitative data matters. And again, benchmarking again is useful, but organic surveys that can be accessed and updated by individuals and that are connected to your human resource systems are much better, so that they can change as the employee status changes as well. Because when you think about things like, when an individual's gender identity changes, if it's connected to your HR system, they can go in there and they can actually change that as well, and you'll have up-to-date valid data too. Cross-evaluation planning as well. Intersectionality. This is essentially what cross-evaluation planning really is. Intersectionality is very important because people are not, we are not monoliths of our identity. I don't only navigate the world as a woman and then sort of switch gears and navigate the world as a Black person. I navigate the world as a Black woman. And so when we have this kind of information and this kind of data, we have to understand that we need to analyze it in a way that considers how, who is represented in our population, what intersections of people's identities exist and which do not. Because yeah, it's great, and we've seen this too with panels, committee members, where you have a panel of individuals and we're like, yay, we've got gender equity, right? We've got 50% of the panel are women, 50% are men, but then everybody's white. right? And so not thinking about intersectionality as an important aspect as well to this work really continues, and continues oppression and marginalization of individuals with intersectional lived identities as well. I'm just being mindful of the time. I'm just going to go for another 4 minutes, but I just have a couple of, closing things for you to think about. Again, when it comes to analyzing demographic data, so now you've collected your data, now you're going to analyze that data. I want to give you just a couple of best practices here as well before I end off about analyzing that data. Because at the end of the day as well, even data is fallible, right? Data is not perfect. It's only, data is limited to who is looking at the data, who is analyzing that data, and who is doing what to that data as well. And so the way in which that data is analyzed, how it gets used, how it gets interpreted as well, is going to be an important aspect of the success of that data, but also most importantly, the safety of that information when it comes to underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, and equity denied groups. So when thinking about your data analysis, make sure that you're answering these questions here. Why are you collecting this identity data? And is it relevant, right? And especially when you're thinking about it from the perspective of research studies. And so I'm kind of going into this now. You'll see a lot of the language in this data analysis is to research studies, but like I said, they're very transferable too. But when you're thinking about it, ask yourself why you're collecting it. Will you analyze this data as aggregated or disaggregated? And if you're going to analyze data disaggregated, make sure that you have some rules. I have a couple of rules here too that I'm going to end off with now in a minute, but make sure that you have sort of rules that you've set out about how you're going to be disaggregating the data so that it doesn't cause more harm or inadvertently identifies certain individuals, and especially this will oftentimes be individuals from equity denied groups or underrepresented groups in your population by isolating that information. Then also, just emphasizing here as well, going to the last one, but do you have the skills and the expertise to analyze the data in a way that does not perpetuate oppression, deficit thinking, or stereotypes about equity deserving groups? I want to emphasize this because I know that especially in administrative offices, there's oftentimes not much diversity. And it's oftentimes individuals who are putting a gaze on individuals that they do not understand and their data and analyzing that and creating conclusions from it and building strategies from it without consulting those individuals. If your office does not include representation from groups like racialized visible minorities or women or individuals with disabilities or individuals from 2S LGBTQ+ communities as well, make sure that before you put it in your report, before you do anything with that information, you actually ensure that you have individuals that you can go to verify that information for you of what your interpretation is, because your very interpretation of that information can perpetuate and do harm. So I just want to encourage you to make sure that when you're analyzing demographic data about individuals' identities, that you do no harm. And so just a last couple of tips for you here is that I would encourage you to think about your rule of 5 or 10. I oftentimes use 5, but sometimes depending on my data set, I will use 10 as well. So this is basically where I don't disaggregate data or provide or report on an analysis where a group includes 5 or less or 10 or less for that population. Because if you have a really large data set and you have 10 or less of certain individuals, it can inadvertently identify those individuals if you analyze their information and report on their information, especially if you're reporting qualitative information as well about them. And so make sure that you're working, that you have those rules and you're thinking about your N size before you're analyzing it so that you have a rule of 5 or a rule of 10, whichever allows further anonymity of that disaggregated data. And then confidentiality versus anonymity. Make sure that you are honest. Be honest with your community as well in how you're communicating that to them, whether or not it is, how you'll be keeping that information confidential as well. And if it is anonymous, do not say that it's anonymous when it's not anonymous, when someone in the back end could actually put their information, their personal information together to actually formulate who they actually are. So don't overpromise anonymity. Make sure you are clear to individuals if you aren't able to maintain that anonymity as well. And then consider as well, again, to, one of the things that I'll kind of leave with you is that I've been encouraging organizations, institutions, because we are, survey fatigue is real. We've had so many surveys over the past few years as well. Collecting information and understanding that collecting this information is important, making sure that you use mechanisms that doesn't burden individuals, but that also doesn't over survey them where they have to complete this every single year. But developing strategies where you can actually collect, have a higher enough response rate that it's going to be good and important, but also that doesn't lead to a burden for individuals later on. So deciding how you're going to be collecting that information is going to be important. Just one last slide here, and I'm going to leave you with this, and then we'll go to Q&A. And I see there's a number of questions up there. But because we are talking about recruitment and hiring strategies, I did want to leave you with a couple of very practical ways you can think about including demographic surveys as part of the recruitment and hiring processes. So in recruitment, you can assess your availability pool, right? By including a demographic survey as part of your job application, or, if it's an internal process, say for seed funding, even at your institution, including a demographic survey. That way, you can actually assess the representation of individuals that are applying to the opportunity as well, right? And then you can say, you can kind of play it back and say, well, where did we go wrong? Why is our availability pool of individuals that are applying for these opportunities not very diverse? It also allows you sort of for comparison between the applicant pool and the successful candidates. So if your applicant pool was highly diverse, but your successful applicants were individuals from, just say one lived identity or lived experience, you need to question your process. It makes you kind of think back and say, ooh, we had a diverse availability pool, which should have led to a, reasonably diverse success pool as well. Why did this not happen? And then it targets the need of the organization as well. So if there is a lack of diversity, right, you can actually say, we know that we have a lack of diversity, so we really need to encourage diverse applicants as well. And so maybe our strategies here is that, we've got, we closed the date for the application, but the number of individuals that we got was not very diverse. How about we lengthen that again, add another month to it and figure out maybe social media strategies or broader recruitment strategies as well that can add to the diversity of our application pool. Cluster hires are a great way that a lot of institutions have been doing this as well. And obviously for a cluster hire, you have to collect demographic data to be able to know if individuals self-identifies as from these groups that you are seeking to provide opportunities for. Again, that's another long conversation to go into. I'm happy to also answer some questions on that. When you're thinking about hiring practices, having the committee or the panel reflect on that information that you've maybe collected from individuals who have applied as well. And who is there, who is not there, and why. Be aware of biases in the process and hold members in the room, especially through the hiring process, hold them accountable as well to how they speak to individuals' identities in the room. And then ensure your institution is ready to make the shift to be more inclusive. You need to have institutional will and buy-in to be able to do this work. And so I'm going to end off over there and just say thank you so much. I think there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, there are. And thank you so much, Dr. Kaniki, for that really thorough and very well presented presentation. So we have received a couple questions to go through. And if anybody has more questions, feel free to put in the Q&A, but we'll just get started so that we can try to get through as many of them as possible. So we've kind of been grouping some of the questions together. So the first question is, how would you address the issue of disagreement within the university community about how to word demographic data collection questions? So for example, based on your discussion of different models of disability, like the social model versus the medical model, asking a demographic question about disability or other facets of someone's social identity that can kind of be contentious at times. So if you could just share your thoughts on navigating those tensions, and that would be fantastic.
One of the things that I think that folks don't realize is that those individuals with those identities need to be at the decision-making table for what those final questions should look like. And I've seen this before too, where it happens where they gather an advisory panel of diverse individuals, right? People with those lived experiences, say racialized, people with disabilities, individuals from the queer community and so on, to be part of an advisory panel. But then the final decision-making group of what the final document or demographic form is actually going to be are all white people, cisgendered, heteronormative, able-bodied individuals. And this is oftentimes where the disconnect comes from. And so I think ensuring that individuals who with these lived experiences are part of the decision-making process in developing those forms. And if you maybe don't even have individuals say part of that, but making sure that whoever is taking on this work is working with those communities. So say maybe you have a group of students and staff and faculty with disabilities that you say, we're developing this question. We'd like this group, to actually develop that for us. Or here's a couple of options or ways that we can do it. What do you think would be the best? And then taking consensus from them rather than taking consensus from able-bodied individuals who are just going to check the no box on that question, right? And oftentimes I see this is where a question is, what the difference is between a highly representative question and a question that does no harm. This is a question that does harm to these communities.
Yeah, definitely. So consultation is, I think, a really important piece that you've highlighted. And going on to our next question and kind of touching on the first question a little bit when it comes to those topics that might be contentious or maybe a softer topic for an individual. So something like socioeconomic status that might be hard to measure. What are some other ways that, like you've seen in your experience, that you can collect data on that information besides something than just like a postal code?
Yes. And so there's many different ways that I think different institutions can do it. I think it depends on what they're going to do with that information, right? And it depends on what the role of the individual is that is completing that form. So when you think about it, you're gonna be looking for different kind of information if it comes from a faculty member versus if it comes from a staff member versus if it comes from a student. And then two, that information is going to be very different for a student that is an undergraduate student, maybe between the ages, of 18 to 25, versus an undergraduate student who is 35 to 45, And so understanding that the way we ask those questions, we have to ask ourselves, what does the array of our population look like that we want to then support? Because, a younger undergraduate student may still be dependent on their parents. However, if we're asking for parents, there's students who are not in that population as well. But then some students who are maybe emancipated from their parents by then already, at that age. And so how are you going to ask those questions? So there's many different ways you can kind of formulate that, I think. But it all depends on what you're using that information for, what the role of those individuals are. Again, too, for staff, it will be very different as well. When you're thinking about socioeconomic status too, maybe with staff, it might actually be historical socioeconomic status too, because you maybe want to hire individuals because you know that oftentimes hiring processes, it's a who not a what and so individuals who don't have those networks or those connections are oftentimes the individuals left out. And because they maybe don't come from historically, sort of legacy folks. We've seen that so much in places like Harvard, where I think it's something like 30% or 35% of their students are legacy students that are let in, right? Understanding that those kinds of things exist. And especially I think when I'm thinking about the staff now too, for institutions and, maybe this is institutions in smaller cities or smaller towns too, where people are so well connected, hiring practices kind of tend to be a tap on the shoulder rather than a really rigorous process too. So I hope that answered the question as well. But socioeconomic status is very complicated. It all depends on why you're information.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, especially just noting that a lot of the time the information connected or collected, depending on the organization or institution, is not going to be used for the same like end goal or aim. So definitely considering that aspect is important. And then also just in light of so going back to your discussion on privacy and the confidentiality of demographic data. So we have a question here saying, how would you address concerns from folks about the data either not being used to inform university policies and practices, or the data being used in a manner that is not anticipated by university community members?
Yeah. And this is where I think we need to hold our institutions accountable for those. There's many mechanisms for that, many ways that you can actually do that. I would say, petitioning as well too through your student council, that if your institution did collect this information, especially on students, you want to see a report on it. You want to know what that is. You want a clarity and transparency of it. The other thing is too, I think a lot of institutions do have annual reports where they actually provide a lot of this information that we actually don't know about, that we don't know exists. I would encourage you to actually Google it. I didn't know that my institution had it. It's sometimes like layered under layered under layered something, but they actually have to report annually on that information that they've collected as well. So they don't always make it public that this report is out now, or the results of the annual equity information is now available. But I would hold them accountable. A lot of institutions too, and I know like U Calgary and U of T, the larger institutions, have now also created a dashboard, right, where they actually publicly have all of that information. U of T's one is really good too. And you can actually go in there and say, in my department, how many racialized faculty do we have? Or how many, women who are racialized faculty members do we have? And you can actually kind of see all of that too, which I think is great too, because this allows you to advocate. And especially if you're part of a group that is doing this work at the institution, you can take that information. That information can be very powerful, and you can use it to advocate in the work that you do.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to during doing student advocacy at Western, there'd just be like random documents that we would find. And it's like, oh, so that actually exists, but it's just not communicated. And something that we always advocated for was having all of those relevant documents in an easily accessible location so that people actually knew they existed. So that's definitely a very important point. And just as a follow-up to that question, our next question states, when collecting data, especially from groups that may be hesitant to do so, or are concerned that the process will be traumatic, which you touched on, what are some ways that we, or like the data collectors, can give back to those groups? So what have you seen, I guess, as best practices or some ways that you think should be implemented?
Yeah, so I think, so one of the key ones, I think, is including those groups at the beginning of the process. So even before you launch your survey, it's engaging with them, like I said, through the development process of the survey itself. And then, keeping them updated on the process, and actually also getting their support for encouraging it. Because what that does is it holds you as the data collector accountable to ensuring that the way you're going to collect that data actually also serves the purpose, or it's a collaborative effort between you and those individuals from those groups. And so my biggest encouragement is to start the process early of building relationships with equity denied groups that you would like to collect that information from. And also first justify to them why you want to collect that data, get their feedback on that justification, and have them be able to be honest, advise you on it, whether you should, or maybe they'll tell you, don't do it. Just don't do it. You don't need this information. It's going to do harm to our community. You need to stop. Don't do it. And maybe that's what you actually need to do. You have to be willing to not do harm and to put those individuals first before your need for data, your institutional requirements, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And moving on to our next question. This one's a little bit long, so just bear with me as I read it all off. But this next person says, in a medical context, for a survey which clients can select more than one racial identity, is there a good way to analyze the data for individuals that input more than one? So the person says, I've considered using a category such as multiracial for people that select more than one, but I feel that this serves to erase some important information. For instance, nearly 3/4 of those who identify as Indigenous on our survey also selected another racial identity, and a multiracial constructed variable hides that from the analysis. At the same time, it feels misleading to prioritize one of their selections or to make a decision about putting some sort of weighting on their selection. So, is there a good way to analyze the data for individuals that would input more than one category on racial identity?
Yes, really great question. And I know something that a lot of researchers are struggling with too, because they don't always have the expertise to understand identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where I would say too, that you should try to also, if you can bring onto your research group, a social scientist, or, a humanities expert that understands the complexity of people's identity, that can actually speak to that. So a couple of things, I have a couple of pieces of advice for this one. Because I've had this too before. I do quite a few surveys, and my racial, the questions based on race, people always are able to respond to more than one. So what I would say is group those who self-identify as Indigenous and another. And if you have, like I said, 5 or more of those, you can group them together and actually, speak to those experiences that they have, depending on what the other outcome is that you're looking at. But you can actually group them together and give that response. If you're finding that you have, like, for example, like I'll say too, I did this one with an institution where an individual checked. So I had the option for South Asian, and then I had the list of countries. So like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so forth. This person picked another, and they said India. And so what I did with that, obviously knowing that they probably just missed that one, I added their data to the South Asian, because I could see that that's how they self-identify. So you have to start to kind of look at and think, you have to understand identity in order to move things around like that. If you don't move it around. Rather, just group it together in a way that you believe or that you can see best serves those individuals' purposes. So if an individual identifies as Indigenous and, maybe other groups as well, I would say go with the most marginalized in that way and maybe group them with Indigenous rather. Or, you can always also kind of count their data multiple times if they have, they've used multiple numbers of, as well. So if they've identified as white, you can also, analyze them in the white group if you've disaggregated it in that way, So there's different ways you can do it. But my biggest advice would be is to speak to someone who kind of understands identity, especially racialized identity, in a way that can explain to you, okay, this individual answered it like this. And you could probably group these groups together, because in society, their experiences we know historically, and there's a lot of research, there's a lot of EDI research, there's a lot of research on identity as well, and people's lived experiences. You can say these individuals' experiences are very similar. So you can actually group these together. It's how we came up sort of with the acronym BIPOC as well. It's how it was created, because oftentimes in populations, the BIPOC group is so small, we can't disaggregate them. So we have to look at the full experiences of individuals who are Indigenous, individuals who are Black, and individuals who are people of color, and we put it together. It's not because we're trying to dissolve them or make them disappear, but because of our data integrity, and to be able to even do something with the data, sometimes we have to group them together so that we can advocate better, right? Because if that group of individuals are saying that we are having bad experiences compared to sort of the majority individuals, then you can advocate more clearly and say, this group of individuals who all identify as, BIPOC, look at their rating of sense of belonging is so low. This is, individuals who are all white, identified as white, this is their sense of belonging. It's really high. We have a problem at our institution here.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that very thorough answer, and hopefully that addressed the question for the person. So we're going to move on to the next question, which I'm sure is a question a lot of people have. And it is, how do we increase participation in the completion of institutional and demographic surveys?
Yeah. Trust. It depends, I would say it depends on your leadership, and it depends on how much your community actually trusts your senior leadership. If your senior leadership communicates consistently and have not only communicated, but have demonstrated a serious commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout the institution, you will have your community a lot more likely to complete that information. Yeah. So that's a big one, I would say. The other is, who is collecting that data? Where is that communication coming from? What I found in my experience, and again, this is just anecdotally, but I find where it's coming from an EDI office versus a human resource office. EDI offices are oftentimes much more trusted as well to collect that data when people are reassured, especially those from underrepresented and marginalized, historically marginalized groups too. They're a lot more likely to provide that information. And especially too, that EDI office is working together with, say, the Indigenous Initiatives Office, where they are also speaking to, Indigenous students, faculty, and staff as well, and they've built that trust, and you're going through those offices that have built trust with the actual community, you will have better response rates. So those are some of the things that I think are important components to it as well. A practical thing that I think is important to getting good response rates is your communications plan. If you don't have a good communications plan, you're gonna have a bad response rate. And what your communications plan needs to include is a lot of the elements that I talked about in this presentation, which is being transparent, being clear about what this data is going to be used for, where it's going to be held, who is collecting this data, all of that information, and normalizing your community to trusting that process will also increase your response rates as well. If your communication is just this arbitrary survey that goes out that just says, please complete, you're going to get a good response rate.
Yeah, definitely. And even back to your point too on holding institutions accountable, if you are holding your institution accountable to do something with this information and produce something, then it's like, okay, I know that this is actually going to do something, or like there's going to be some kind of result, and it's not just like a arbitrary statistic that's going to be lost somewhere. So I definitely echo those sentiments. And then we're going to move on to our final question now, and so sorry to anybody whose question we weren't able to address. But this person asked, do you have any suggested resources on best practices that they're able to access and the audience can access to further look into this topic and learn more?
Oh, yes. I'm going to reach over here. I'm going to bring out some books.
Go ahead.
So I've kind of made a little mini collection of books that I would highly recommend, that a lot of even the information from my slides and so on are taken from. So first, an expert I would strongly suggest is Dr. Sonia Kang. She is a Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto, who does research on identity. and bias in metrics and in this work. So a lot too of the information that I've learned on this topic is actually also from her. So Dr. Sonia Kang at the University of Toronto, she's an amazing Canadian expert. But then there's this one is a book, Inclusalytics, that I also use a lot. It's a really, really great resource. Doing EDI or DE&I, as they call it in the US, on and data. And then there's like a couple of really good ones too, I would say. So Indigenous Statistics is another one I really like using as well. You can see that. I'm sure you'll have it in the recording here, but Decolonizing Data, really, really good one too. Over here. And then this one, then there's this one too, Queer Data. So this is by Kevin Green. Yes, Queer Data. It's another really, really good one when thinking about demographics for 2S LGBTQ+. And then just a general DE&I book that has become sort of my go-to is one by Lily Zhang, and it's more thinking about strategic EDI, and this is DEI Deconstructed. So it's by Lily Zhang. And they go through a lot of these strategies, including data strategies as well, and collecting data and information. Lily Zhang is also a DE&I practitioner. I do a lot of my work. I emulate a lot from what they do. And so, yeah, I love their frameworks and the way that they present DE&I work. So just...
Perfect. No, that was great information. And to all the audience members, this recording will be posted in case you want to scroll through and pause and take pictures of some of those books. But we overall just want to say a really big thank you to you, Dr. Kaniki, and I'm going to pass it over to Ikram, who's going to close us off.
Thank you, Eunice. Well, first of all, I would like to thank or give our immense gratitude to Dr. Kaniki. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, for joining us today, for also inviting us all to think collectively about how we can use an equity lens when collecting, analyzing, and utilizing demographic data in higher education. I think your presentation has solidified our knowledge that this is such a worthy project for us, but also an enormous responsibility and a complex one at that. So we're really grateful. We know there's a lot of work ahead of us here at Carleton as we collect this data and do all the thinking that you shared today and more. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank and extend our great big thank you to Eunice Olidejo, who ensured that everything was fully organized and set for the event today, skillfully moderated the Q&A. And also thank you to Eunice for coordinating all aspects of the EDI speaker series, this being the last session. You have done an amazing work. It's been wonderful working with you, and we so enjoyed how well you have put everything together. So thank you very much. The speaker series is something that I and my colleague Krista Craven designed. So I want to thank Krista for bringing the idea to life with me. Thank you also to our team at the Department of Equity and Inclusive Communities for fully supporting the series and its implementation. Everybody had a hand in it, so we were so grateful. I also would like to give a big thanks to our ASL interpreters and our live captioners from AI Media for helping make this event more accessible, and to the technical support provided by production services at Carleton to ensure this event run as smoothly as possible. We want to thank the CRC for funding the speaker series, and to the chorus team at Carleton for their support in managing the EDI stipend from CRC. Finally, thank you so much to all of you who attended the session today, and those of you who attended the previous sessions, as well as all the other, listen to all the other speakers. We really appreciate you joining us. Just a reminder that all 4 sessions recordings will be on the website, which is the EDI speaker series. So if you Google EDI or search EDI speaker series at Carleton, you will find the site. Please share with your colleagues, listen to it if you have missed some parts of it. This is a conclusion to the EDI speaker series, but not an end to our work and connection with you all. So thank you again, and wishing you all a good afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone.